Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank all the participants who have joined today. I'm David Silvera, head of the business unit at Mustard Seed Communities and a member of the Gender and Disabilities Affairs Committee of the PSOJ. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the PSOJ's webinar on the ability to access a conversation on disabilities inclusion. Today's webinar would not be possible without the kind support of our sponsors, Lifespan and Digicel Foundation. On behalf of the PSOJ, I'd like to thank them both. So thank you for coming on board, and allow me to provide some background to today's webinar. The Center for Disease Control defines disability as any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. According to the World Health Organization, disabilities has 3 dimensions: impairment in a person's body, structure or function, or mental functioning. Examples of impairment would be a loss of a limb, loss of vision, or memory loss. Second one is activity limitation, such as difficulty seeing, hearing, walking, or problem solving. The third is participation restrictions in normal daily activities, such as working, engaging in social and recreational activities, and obtaining health care and preventative services. Now, these disabilities can be related to conditions that are present at birth, could be related to an injury associated with a long-standing condition, for example, diabetes, which can cause a disability such as vision loss, nerve damage, or limb loss, and also associated with a progressive disease over time. In 2006, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and International Human Rights Treaty of the United Nations was written. It was intended to protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities globally. Jamaica is a signatory to the convention, and the Disabilities Act was passed in 2014 in Jamaica. In October 2021, some 7 years later, the regulations were tabled and passed, and thus the act is set to take effect in February 2022. So what does this mean for the disabled community in Jamaica? And what will this mean for how businesses operate under the act? Do we even know what the regulations consist of? So today we're going to take a look and make an attempt to answer these questions and more as we seek to break down the Disabilities Act and the regulations and find out what it really means. We're going to discuss the accessibility of infrastructure to the disabled. We're going to hear from some persons living with disabilities about the challenges they face on a daily basis and the solutions they seek. So I'd like to introduce you to our panel, our very distinguished guest today. We have Dr. Christine Hendricks. She's the Executive Director of the Jamaican Council for Persons with Disabilities, the JCPD, and she's known both locally and internationally as a champion for the disabled. We have Mrs. Dion Jennings. Mrs. Jennings is the Chief Technical Director of the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities. We have Ms. Charmaine Daniels, and she's the CEO of the Digicel Foundation, which has been a strong supporter of the disabled in Jamaica and in other countries they're in. And we have Dr. Hickswell Douglas, a literacy specialist and a person living with a disability. So I would like to thank Stephanie McIntyre Groves. She's our sign language interpreter who will be providing sign language during the webinar. Okay, so let's get straight into it. We're going to start our discussion with an overview of the Disabilities Act. And for this, I'd like to introduce Dr. Christine Hendricks and Mrs. Dion Jennings. Take it away, ladies.
It's a pleasure for us to be joining in this webinar. And we're happy that it has coincided with the Disabilities Awareness Week. So on behalf of the Ministry of Labour and Social Security and the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities, we're happy to share in this event. And so In context, as was mentioned, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals delivers the 2030 mantra, wherein no one should be left behind. And so the Vision 2030 National Sector Plan ensures the Vision 2030, let's start again. So the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Section 27, promotes the inclusion of persons with disabilities in the workplace. And there's this nexus between the CRPD, which was mentioned earlier, that the Jamaican government has signed and ratified in 2007, and the Disabilities Act, which seeks to promote and ensure the full and equal enjoyment by persons with disabilities of privileges, interests, benefits, and treatment on an equal basis with others. The UN Sustainable Development Goals of 2015 ensures that we deliver the 2030 agenda under the mantra, no one should be left behind. The Vision 2030 National Development Plan is akin to this 2030 agenda, and the vision statement of persons with disabilities seeks to ensure an inclusive, accessible, providing opportunities for all, and recognizing the rights and freedoms and responsibilities for persons with disabilities in the process of nation building. So it is very important that we recognize the fundamental rights of persons with disabilities. The 2017 National Labor Market Survey, the Guide to Employment Opportunities in Jamaica, shows that 68% of respondents confirmed that their companies did not have anyone employed that had a disability. It also indicated that 56% of persons stated that they had no established policies to facilitate persons with disabilities. 60% said that there was no policy to facilitate persons who had become disabled throughout the course of employment. Let's now look at an overview of the Disabilities Act. The Disabilities Act comprises 11 parts, and we are trying to summarize this in a very precise way today. Part 1 speaks to the preliminary and includes the interpretation of different definitions, key definitions that are important in understanding the Act. And it also presents the objects of the Act. Part 2 establishes the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities as a body corporate, which Section 28 of the Interpretation Act applies and sets out the JCPD, which would be a new council, its functions, its ability to develop codes of practice. It establishes a board, management board, the confidential register, the registration of persons with disabilities, and other related functions. Part 2 of the Disabilities Act also sees the Jamaica Council of Persons with Disabilities having the ability to develop codes of practice. And these are provides guidance on matters under the Act and practical guidance for the avoidance of discrimination on the ground of a disability. Part 3 highlights the Disabilities Rights Tribunal, a very important aspect of the Act, which seeks to protect the rights of persons with disabilities. It provides for its establishment, for complaints, for dispute procedures, and alternative dispute resolutions. The purpose of this tribunal is to settle and hear complaints of aggrieved persons with disabilities and it sets out the constitution of the tribunal in the 3rd schedule of the Act. It is of note that the awards of the Disabilities Rights Tribunal are final and can only be challenged on a point in the Supreme Court. Part 4 of the Disabilities Act provides for the protection from discrimination. And later on, we'll have the elaboration on discrimination. Part 4 provides the right to education and training for persons with disabilities. And it also has in Part 6, employment. Discrimination against applicants. Discrimination against applicants, as well as duty of the employer to make adjustments, redeployment of employees are provided for under the section dealing with employment. Part 7 deals with the right to political office and public life. Part 8 speaks to access to healthcare and health facilities and make provisions for health providers in ensuring persons can access healthcare. Part 9 speaks to access to premises, the right to access premises and housing. And in terms of premises, it speaks to both existing premises, new premises, and alterations to these premises, and ensures that there's no discrimination as it relates to access to premises. Part 10 speaks to access to public passenger vehicles, and Part 11 speaks to different miscellaneous provisions, including the review of the Disabilities Act within 3 years, and also to the inclusion of the regulations. But what are the objectives of the Act? The Act seeks to reinforce and promote the recognition and the acceptance of persons with disabilities in Jamaica, ensuring that they have the same fundamental rights as any other person in Jamaica. It also promotes individual dignity and autonomy, including the freedom of choice and independence of a person with disability. One other important objective of the Act is to promote the respect for differences and the acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity. It also seeks to ensure full and effective participation and inclusion of persons with disabilities in the society on an equal basis. And finally, it seeks to prevent or prohibit discrimination against a person with disability. Part 1, Section 2 of the Act highlights the definition which speaks to access. And access refers to and includes the following 3 areas. Access to premises, which means the freedom to enter in or to approach or to communicate with, make use of, or maneuver within any premises. So if someone can enter a doorway, a room, and they're in a wheelchair without any difficulty, it means they can access the premises readily. It also ensures access to benefits, which means a person with disability can access the use of any benefits that are available to them. Access to communication, the capacity for a person with disability to receive and make use of information, and accessible shall be construed accordingly. In terms of accessible feature, it includes rails, ramps, lowered table, signs, used to help persons with disabilities in their daily movements. These are just some examples. And accessible aids include Braille, hearing aids, canes, crutches, wheelchairs, technology devices used to support persons with disabilities in their everyday life. And when we talk about to communicate, we're talking about including the use of Braille, display of text, large print, audio, accessible multimedia, human reader, and other augmentative and alternative modes of communication. It includes oral and oral communication, tactile communication, and communication technology. What about the Disabilities Act regulations? We won't be able to delve deeply into this, but it makes provision for 4 key areas. Areas relating to registration of a person with a disability, and having gone through that process is able to access a certificate of registration, which the new council is to provide once the person with disability meets the eligibility criteria. It also makes provision for the confidential registry, a registry that will include all persons with disabilities, and there are provisions in the regulations if there's information that has been provided outside of the authority. It also makes provision for lessee and lessor, and these are forms that are prescribed to enable persons who would want to access housing, particularly in terms of rental, where they would have to make the necessary applications through the local authorities and access any alteration that is necessary and agreed to with the landlord. So these are some of the provisions in the regulations. And then I'll now hand over to Dr. Hendricks, who will speak to workplace inclusion and what it means for employers and employees, persons with disabilities.
Okay, thank you very much, Mrs. Jennings. If you could just remove the screen so that I can have access to share. Thank you so much. So Section 29 of the Disabilities Act speaks to the aspect of employment. And it states that an employer shall not discriminate against a person with a disability who is otherwise qualified for employment in terms of the employment afforded to that employee, in relation to the opportunities afforded to the employee for promotion, transfer, training, or the receipt of any other benefit, or by dismissing the person because of his disability, by dismissing him or subjecting him by virtue of his disability to any other detriment without reasonable cause. In terms of workplace inclusion, to ensure full inclusion, there are 3 main concepts that should be examined in the Disabilities Act. That's non-discrimination, 2, reasonable arrangements, and redeployment. When we talk about non-discrimination, we're talking about the fact that any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disability, which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition of enjoyment or exercise on an equal basis with others of privileges, legal interests, rights, benefits, and treatment in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, religious, educational, or any other field, and includes all forms of discrimination, including the denial of reasonable arrangement. So once there is any distinction or exclusion or restriction because of the disability, then that is construed as discrimination. Reasonable arrangements are the necessary and appropriate modification and adjustments, not imposing a disproportionate or undue burden where needed in a particular case, to ensure that the person with a disability can enjoy basis with others, the privileges, interests, benefits, and treatments, and the facilitation of such privileges, interests, benefits, and treatment by the provision of auxiliary aids and services. And such includes A, equipment or devices that alleviate the effects of a disability being experienced by a person. B, the acquisition or modification of such equipment or devices. C, duly qualified interpreters, and we have one right here this morning with us. Technologies and effective methods of making orally delivered and received materials available to a person with a disability. And duly qualified readers, taped audiovisually recorded text, or other effective methods of making visually delivered and received materials available to a person with a disability. So reasonable arrangement is anything that will allow the individual with the disability to function effectively in their environment. Workplace inclusion begins with disability management. And this is to manage disability-related issues in the workplace. Now, the onus is on the employers to ensure that they include a strategy for managing disability as part of an integral part, which is an integral part of the overall employment policy. And this process should first be implemented as part of the human resource development strategy in your workplaces. Now you may wonder, why should the onus be on the employer? You see, anyone can acquire a disability at any point in time. And most times on the workplace, at the workplaces, persons tend to acquire a disability. And what do you do with a valuable resource because they end up having a disability? I'm sure you wouldn't want to dismiss them. So disability management should be part of your policy and workplace strategy. There is also need for social integration and campaigning for disability employment. And as awareness grows, training sessions on the rights of persons with disabilities to a safe and decent work, and the improvements to accessibility to education and training will help to produce qualified and competent candidates for the Jamaican workforce. So it is very important, very critical to ensure that the entire our systems, our education system and our training systems are accessible and safe for persons with disabilities to participate in, so that they can matriculate, they can enter into the workforce as qualified and competent employees. This is essential so that employers can expand their pool of talent and skills, because people with disabilities do have those to offer to the employment space. So in terms of accessibility, that's the next important concept to understand and integrate in your policy. In terms of employing persons with disabilities, employers should take the necessary steps to provide reasonable arrangements that we spoke of earlier in respect of accessibility to and at the workplace. For example, wheelchair accessibility, varying technologies for different disability groups, health insurance, similar to what you would provide for your other members of staff, and so on. In terms of recruitment and hiring, workplace recruitment program, entities should feel free to forge relationships with different organizations, schools, training institutes, other companies that support persons with disabilities and assist with recruitment. In terms of posting of job advertisements, compose job descriptions that are accessible for all. So there is need to ensure that when you post an advertisement, it is accessible to all persons, including people with disabilities. So those who are blind, if it is on your website should be so accessible that the person who is blind should be able to access the advertisement so that they too can have a chance to apply for that job. In terms of the interview process, HR managers have the responsibility to select qualified staff irrespective of disability, and reasonable arrangements should be made to accommodate persons with disabilities. This process begins from the shortlisting of interviewees, preparation for the interview, and the interview questions. So the interview should not be focusing on the individual with the disability. You know, locks, how do you manage? How will you manage to work? How do you manage on a day-to-day basis? No, the question should focus, similarly like others, on the job and the work at hand. Retaining and advancing employees. Studies have shown that employers and employees both benefit from a work environment that facilitates the retention of all skilled, qualified workers through effective job accommodations for employees with disabilities. Employers should provide equal access to career development, training, and advancement opportunities for employees with disabilities. You know, what we have found sometimes is that employers tend to, or sometimes, employ persons with disabilities low level, and they maintain that throughout their life in the organization. But we are encouraging that persons with disabilities be allowed to advance, you know, allow them to grasp the opportunities for career development as well. A person that acquires a disability while employed, the employer has a responsibility to encourage the staff in any redeployment or job retention opportunities. In terms of dismissal, an employer should not dismiss or fire an employee based on his or her disability status. An employer will not be deemed, okay, so there are clauses that will speak to in areas where it is not, it could be deemed as discrimination, but it is not discrimination. So an employer will not be deemed discriminating against a person with a disability on the basis that, one, the circumstance of the dismissal is justifiable, and the dismissal could not be avoided under the circumstances that would occur. Now, it is important in terms of reasonable arrangement to help us to understand a concept that the convention highlights, and it is carried through in the Disabilities Act, and it speaks about universal design, which is important if it is that we're thinking of how we design our spaces, how we provide services, and how we also provide products. So universal design is the process of designing an environment so that it can be accessed, understood, and used by all people, regardless of their age, their size, their ability, or their disability. When universal design principles are applied, products and environments meet the need of potential users with a wide variety of characteristics. And disability is just one of those many characteristics that an individual might possess. For example, if you look at this service counter, that is a typical service counter in a place of business. However, it is not accessible to everyone, including those who are short of stature, those who use wheelchairs, or those who just cannot stand for extended periods of time. applying universal design principles might result in the design of a counter that has multiple heights. The standard height designed for individuals within the average range of height and who use the counter while standing up, and also for shorter persons who are shorter than the average, or if they use their chair for mobility, or if you simply prefer to interact with the service staff from a seated position. Inclusive in terms of the relevance to the business sector, inclusive policy ensures that accommodation or inclusion of matters relating. When we're talking about the relevance to the business sector, an inclusive policy ensures that there are accommodations and inclusion of matters relating to persons with disability. So when we're crafting our policy, if it is inclusive, then it will accommodate and include persons with disabilities and every other person who has other characteristics that would need to fit into the environment. The inclusion of disability sensitization in your orientation and your training manual. So it is important that when those training manuals are being developed, that there is disability sensitization as part of the orientation process for everyone coming through the organization. And it will also be there in the training manuals. Ensure that the staff, there's capacity building of the staff based on the current trends of disability that evolves over time. And also ensure when you're thinking about your policy development that there are persons with disabilities who can be sitting at the table to share the ideas of how this policy and how the workplace can be developed into a place for all. It is also important, and the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities can provide support in this by using what we have as an accessibility checklist. It will help employers to journey from entrance to the workplace to exit and all aspects of the employment space. So the checklist will help you to look at how we approach your entrance, the car parking, your signage, the external level changes, meaning if there are many steps up or what, or there is a smooth or a level playing, level ground from which to move from one place to the next. It considers entrances, including your reception area, horizontal movement, vertical movement, your internal doors, your sanitary accommodations, fixtures and fittings, information and controls, means of escape, and building management, etc. It also speaks to website development to ensure that it is inclusive. Of course, we said earlier, as I said earlier, that there are accessibility audits that will be provided by the new Council for Persons with Disabilities so that employers can be assured that their space is safe. And the varying areas that we will look at are the workstations, workstation equipment, where meetings are conducted, and ensuring that there is health and safety regulations, as I know that the OSH bill is there for persons to utilize as a guide. In terms of reasonable arrangements, and you will see on the screen various indications of some of the reasonable arrangements. So the first one shows the parking space with the accessible sign, with the international accessible sign, and you will note that the parking space is not the regular parking space, but it is maybe a parking space and a half to allow for reasonable arrangement and access. The second one is a building showing the ramps next to stairs that allow for access to both persons who prefer the stairs or those who prefer to walk on the ramp. The third one indicates that sign language is provided. You see the shadow of two individuals with the hand, indicating that at this workplace or in this store or whatever, sign language is provided. The fourth picture that the cursor is on shows a person in a wheelchair utilizing a machine in the office, and using the wheelchair, she can access the machine without asking anyone. She can be independent, moving around in the environment. And the last one shows the type of doorknobs that there should be. The accessible, the universally designed is the one that has the handle. The round one is not the one that is recommended, because persons with physical disabilities, in terms of whether they have no hand at all or no fingers or some fingers, the handle makes the door with the handle makes it easier for access. In conclusion, making a product or an environment accessible to persons with disabilities often benefit others. For example, automatic door openers benefit individuals using walkers and wheelchairs, but also it benefits persons carrying groceries, holding babies, as well as elderly citizens. Sidewalk curb cuts, which are designed to make sidewalks and streets accessible to those using wheelchairs, are often more used by kids on skateboards, parents with baby strollers, and delivery staff with carts. When television displays in airports and restaurants are captioned, programming is accessible not only to people who are deaf, but also to others who cannot hear the audio because the area is noisy. So universal design is a goal that puts high values on diversity, equality, and inclusiveness. But I do know that this is a process. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. There is the information to contact the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities.
Okay, I'd like to thank both Mrs. Jennings and Dr. Hendricks for those presentations. What we're going to ask our participants to do is, if you have questions, you can type them at the side and we will compile them. And then at the end of the webinar, we will put some time for those questions. But in the meantime, Mrs. Jennings and Dr. Hendricks, what changes should people living with disabilities expect as a result of the Act?
Okay, so as a result of the implementation of the Disabilities Act, legislation that will impact them and will impact society in a positive way. For the very, very first time, they can have the opportunity to complain, to make a complaint regarding discrimination and have the matter investigated and heard. For the first time, they will be enabled to have a certificate of registration when they register as a person with a disability. So they will have a document that verifies their disability, because very often there are persons who have disabilities, but because the disability is invisible, persons at times who do not believe that they really have a disability. Sometimes people are blind and they move around so independently, and visually impaired. They move around so independently that if it is that they tell people that they have a disability, they won't believe. So this certificate of registration will be provided to persons with disabilities who register, and they will have that. Additionally, they will have the tribunal that will hear their matters of discrimination and settle the matter there. And so it is an exciting day for persons with disabilities and this society, and we look forward to the implementation of it. I'm sure there are many more benefits that we can't even think of or dream of right now, but as it unfolds, I'm sure the conversation next year this time will add those things.
Okay. Mrs. Jennings, you've given us some examples of what businesses need to do from the Act. Is there a timeline for these changes to be made by businesses once the regulations coming into force next year?
You want me to take it?
I don't want.
Sorry, Mrs. Oh.
Okay, so the Act comes into effect February next year, February 14, 2022. And of course, there are provisions that are to be made. For example, the developments of codes of practice that will provide the guidelines on the different rights that are outlined. We'll have a new council that will come into effect, will make provisions for those. And once those are signed off, then it will be providing the guide for the persons in the business sector to utilize. Also, in terms of premises and buildings, once the Act comes into effect, there's a 2-year window that will allow the alterations and changes to be made. But for new buildings, those need to be considered and to be utilized now in terms of any construction for new facilities. Those should be bearing in mind the provisions under the Act to ensure that they are accessible for persons with disabilities. So those are just a few. Okay, so it's a 2-year timeline, and people, new buildings should be doing that from now. Is it correct? Because the building code and the Building Act makes provision for these changes. But what we need to do is to ensure that there's an enforcement of the provisions within the code and the Building Act to ensure that there is that alignment with the Disabilities Act. Because the law is only as good as the enforcement of that law. Indeed. Okay. Thank you both. So I see a few people raising hands. We're just asking you if you could type your questions and we will get to them at the end. So we've now heard from the experts. Thank you for that display, both your presentations. But let's hear from someone who will be most impacted by the implementation of Disabilities Act. We're going to invite Dr. Hickswell Douglas to comment on the Act and whether he thinks the regulations are sufficient.
Thanks, moderator.
You're there, Dr. Douglas?
Are you hearing me?
Hearing you fine, yes.
Okay, good, thanks.
So I wanted you to sort of share some of the challenges you've faced along your journey as a vision impaired, as someone, and to recommend solutions to prevent other persons with disabilities from facing similar challenges.
Thank you very much, sir. I am totally blind, and I am a trained teacher, counselor, and my last employment had to do with working as an assistant chief education officer in the Ministry of Education. It means, therefore, that for the better part of my entire life, I have worked with government. In my capacity as a teacher and a counselor working in a school environment, some of the biggest problems I had, the challenges, had to do with attitude towards my blindness and discrimination, in that because of negative attitudes, people have the perception that although you may be qualified, you are not as competent to execute the tasks, the duties, and the responsibilities assigned to you. And as a consequence, I was often overlooked for things like promotions. And in addition to being overlooked for promotions, people unwittingly, unintentionally used language and behaved in ways that served to be very discriminatory. In order to overcome some of those issues as a teacher, one of the most important things for me was to ensure that I was always very qualified and become a strong advocate for myself. So when there were instances of discrimination, what I did was to gain additional qualifications, which placed me in a position where administrators would not look so very smart if they decided to overlook it. Imagine being a teacher and being more qualified than your principal, your vice principal, and most of your senior teachers. And so eventually, only when I got my master's degree did I get a promotion as a senior teacher. It tells us, though, that workplace policies are going to be very, very critical, and that the Disability Act, when enforced, is going to serve as a very useful tool to prevent this kind of discrimination. In addition, it meant that I had to go the extra mile and to do things that other people wouldn't ordinarily do. And this wasn't necessarily fair to me. It only benefited me because I became a better expert at the things I did. And I was always in the face of other people. When you do things like that, you're better able to advocate and to point out that you have exceeded the expectations, you have excelled, and in such circumstances, persons feel not so very happy being a big-time discriminator, as I would want to call them. When I decided to work with the Ministry of Education as an education officer and as a senior person, things were a bit different, but attitude is attitude. And you're going to find that out of ignorance, a lot of persons are going to say things and do things that can be offensive. So in order to mitigate those things, it is very important for people to understand how to communicate with and about persons with disabilities, and to use a person-first language, which helps to maintain the dignity of the employee. So for example, I am a person who happens to be blind. I'm not just a blind man. I am a man first. I am a person first. And the same thing applies to all other persons with disabilities. They are persons first. And it's important to have sensitization so that people know what to say, how to say it, and so on and so forth. Very, very important. In addition to all of that, we need to understand the courtesies too. There are a lot of people who are very helpful on the job and want to do things for you. And people will want to put you down to offer you a seat, and they want to push you down to sit down because they are seeing the chair, you're not seeing it, and unless we train them to understand how to do certain things, it's going to be difficult. We don't stand beside a person in a wheelchair and start grabbing the chair and lifting the chair and touching the person without getting permission to do things like that. The same thing applies to persons who are blind. And so people with good intentions do the wrong things. Working as an education officer was very interesting because I discovered early that the staff orders had certain provisions for traveling officers. And as a consequence of that, I was able to access the services of a driver to take me around to visit my various schools. And that is in the staff order. A lot of persons are not aware, if you're a traveling officer and you have a disability, you can benefit from that kind of provision. Not only that, but within my ministry at the time, I, through advocacy, was able to attend a number of international conferences over the world and had the opportunity to take my driver as my sighted guide. This again is using the staff orders, using advocacy in order to advocate for the things that you really need. In addition to things like those, I was fortunate to have a computer and to get the appropriate software to help me. Notwithstanding all of that kind of support, however, you still had persons who needed to be sensitized. Persons, you go to a conference or you go to a meeting and persons see a cane leaning against a wall and they start mumbling and muttering and wondering. Whereas if they understood the courtesy, they could just come across and ask a question. and things would be okay, because I would be ready and willing to say the same information over and over again. Tiresome though it may be at times to be repeating the same thing. So policies in the workplace are going to guide how employers and colleague employees will interact with, how they will think about, speak about, write about, and interact with the person in the work environment with the disability. Those things are very, very critical, because apart, if you don't have those conditions, you can affect the self-esteem and the confidence level of persons with disabilities in the workplace. Self-determination is something that we have to encourage our persons with disabilities to exercise. And we can be determined in asking for things, in making suggestions, in making recommendations about how things can be changed. One of the things I did at my school and in the ministry was to advocate for new things. And when new things were implemented, then yeah, you get a pat on the shoulder. You may still hear, yeah, he did that and so on, but we're still not considering him for certain things. Within the ministry, I was fortunate that my work stood out for itself, and my permanent secretary and then minister were the ones who actually decided that I should have been promoted. Now, it was good that this was coming from the top. The truth be told, I really didn't want the promotion for various reasons, probably feeling incompetent in some ways and so on and so forth. But they saw the need and they were the ones who recommended the promotion. So what it says is that if you perform with excellence, whatever you do as a person with a disability, if you autograph your work with excellence, it will be seen, it will be recognized, and it will be rewarded. So for me, attitude change is going to be very, very important, and it comes through sensitization, understanding the courtesies about persons with disabilities so that people don't keep making stereotypical statements. They say, boy, you dress nice today, who dressed you? As if to say I don't have any taste for myself as to what color shirt and what color tie I am going to wear. So things like those are very important for people to understand, or people coming up to you and say, I'm sure you must recognize my voice, or you must recognize me by this perfume. And some of the perfume really not smell so good, you know. And some of the voices over time change from female sounding to male sounding, and some of them have a little rust on it. So what we're saying is, if people understand the courtesy rules and they understand the language around disabilities, things like those will make the life of a person with a disability far more comfortable. And then the policies will reward qualified, hardworking, competent people, and we'll be able to get rid of some of the other things. So Mrs. Hendricks spoke about special arrangements and accommodations. Those are important. If you don't get it, the ministry organized training for computer skills, but the person doing the training didn't know anything about any of the assistive devices or artificial intelligence, so they couldn't train me. So I sat there and felt like a stooge for a good portion of the time. And so it is going to be very, very important that the policy documents stipulate that if you're having a training, then you must cover everybody. And so, ladies and gentlemen, those are but a few points that I would want to share just now until persons, and if and when persons have questions for me to give additional clarifications or examples. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Hickswell. Hickswell is a member of the Disabilities Committee here at the PSOJ, and I can guarantee you, if your company is ever looking for an amazing speaker, he is the man. I would now like to invite Ms. Charmaine Daniels to speak about the work done by the Digicel Foundation and the challenges she identifies affecting that community and the work that needs to be done to resolve them. Charmaine, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yes, it's still morning. Thank you for being here. This is such an emotive topic, and I'm so glad to see that you all took the time to be with us this morning. As most of you would know, Digicel Foundation has been the leading foundation in this space of special needs and working in this particular, like these people that are speaking to you this morning, I consider very good friends because we do a lot of work together, and Dr. Hendricks is probably tired of me sometimes, but we're all trying to achieve the same goal. So just quickly to tell you some of the things that we have done, we had really focused on awareness and the plight of persons with special needs. Most of you would know the Digital 5K, and the 5K was born out of a need for us to just really ramp up the awareness of persons with disabilities in Jamaica. We have done registration drives in partnership with other entities for the Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities. But primarily, we have really focused on building schools for children with disabilities. And to date, Digital would have built or renovated 10 special needs schools that we continue to fund with their special projects year on year, as well as we would have worked with the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Labor as well, to just do some of their special needs units in existing schools. So we would have been renovating a number of those for persons and for the kids that go there. Ramp in Schools program, we have done a number of ramps in schools, and we continue. As a matter of fact, this year, we had a slight twist to that, and what we were really spending time doing was the ODPM had reached out with a number of their shelters, which also happened to be schools that didn't have ramps. So in a time of disaster, it was very hard for persons in wheelchairs to access these facilities. So this year, we are putting 5 ramps in schools, just in partnership for the ODPM to make sure that these facilities are accessible. So that's what, I mean, we could go on and on about what we do in this space. However, given the conversation we're having, I'd like to really talk about the workplace. I joined Digital in 2006. And when I joined, I was very surprised and pleased to see persons with disabilities employed, sitting beside me, working along with me. And the range of disabilities was interesting as well. And so Digital has a long history of employing persons with disabilities. Right now, we have 7 persons with disabilities across our group and our Jamaica office here in Kingston. And you will see that across the multiple countries that we operate in. It is a drive and it is a personal goal of ours to really employ persons with disabilities. And with that program, what it meant was you had 17 persons who were trained in different computer programs, and they came through Digital. We still have today 6 of those persons with us. And that program, my team in particular, I have Jenard Williamson, and Jenard is a favorite of mine. He's really the life of the team, and what he does, he really keeps us grounded. But the funny thing about it is, being in a wheelchair does not slow Jenard down, if anybody knows Jenard. Jenard functions and pulls us to be better and inspire us. And to tell you the truth, he's not treated any differently. And I've listened to the need for the policies, and it's true, they are there. But what I've also found is that when you put someone like this in a workspace and they're competent and they're working, you forget that they have a disability or it's not top of mind. They're just a person, they're a team member who's pulling their weight and getting things done and inspiring us to do more. I mean, Jenard lift boxes in his wheelchair. He's always just ahead of us and just pulling us to do more. And so I just want to say to those employers who are out there who sometimes you think to employ someone with a disability will be hard, is to say it's really not. It's really not that hard. And because we couldn't have the 5K this year, we were struggling with what would we do around awareness as a team. And we decided that we wanted to advocate for employment. So what we found is we have spent a lot of money schooling persons with disabilities, but what is the hope at the end of that? Will they have gainful employment? You know, so they can stand proud, that they can plan their lives, that they can, Jenard got a driver's license and is driving now, he's bought his car. And so for me, that's a milestone. It embarrasses me because he probably drives better than I do, but it's just a challenge to us all, you know, what else? The sky's the limit. And so what we wanted to do was look at how could we drive some awareness. And we came up with a little document that I'm just going to share with you. I'm sure Dr. Hendricks has far better documents than I do, but I just wanted to really show you what our thought process was as a company as we looked at this. So we looked at what are some of the barriers, how do we get more internships for persons with disabilities, and for our adults who are at UE, because we do get a lot of applications. How do we encourage our partners out there to employ them and make meaningful change? You know, we can all do the easy thing of just talking, but how do we go about really helping? And so we broke the work we do around special needs down into 4 buckets. And these may not be the conventional buckets, but this is what we thought these are the types of persons we interact with all the time. And even as we did this exercise, we were mindful that as a company, it wouldn't be, and we can't hire someone that is blind. I'm sorry, Dr. Douglas, but it was one of the things that we realized, because our elevators are not audio, you know, and we were embarrassed by that fact. I am embarrassed by that fact. If you look at me, I'm probably turning red because right now we're scrambling to fix that. But it doesn't mean that you can't employ someone with a disability just because you don't have all the pieces in place. So for us, we do have physical and we have intellectual disabilities among the persons in this special grouping that we hire. And what we did here, we just looked at what would we need as a company to be able to focus on these groups. And we set out to just detail what those things were. And then we have shared this with our HR and we have said, hey, you now need to make sure that all these things are in place and a policy. And I really appreciate the presentation earlier by Dr. Hendricks and Mrs. Jenkins, because that will help to guide us in some of the things that we need to put in place in terms of hiring, how our job descriptions are placed out there. Those were things that we did not really think of, even though we have had persons with disabilities employed us. We just never really thought, how do we allow them to feel that they can be a part of our process? And so we're being very deliberate in what we're doing in terms of technology. We also looked at that. What would we need? So here it is, we brought down some. Of course, Dr. Hendricks' list was far more extensive than mine, and I would actually like her presentation. So we can use it to build out this, but it was just, you know, for us, it was just, how do we live what we're talking about? And I would like to encourage and challenge all of you to just think about it in that light. One of the things the foundation did earlier this year, so Stephanie, we're coming for your job, is we made sure we did level 1 certification for sign language with JSL. So it's easy to do. We had 1 hour for 7 weeks on a Thursday. They would teach us sign language, and it was great, because then when we go out and we're doing projects, we're able to talk to the kids. When DEFCAN, we have DEFCAN here every month, and before we did this course, we were not able to really communicate with them in the way that they were comfortable. But now you should see us in the lobby just trying it out. And our HR department is committed to getting sign language training for our staff and making it available. And so these are just some of the simple things that you can do in your organizations that will help you. And here were the HR practical steps we did, you know, in our advertising for jobs, make sure persons of disabilities is included, amend the application forms to make sure it is a form that they can fill out and that it meets their needs. And then just double check our health policy to make sure that if there's specific things that relates to the persons within this community, that as we hire them, their needs are being served. And it's great to see that part of the act is also about healthcare. And these are just some of the very practical steps that we looked at at Digicel, and will continue to evolve with the help of our friends. And I just want to encourage you as corporations, you know, don't be afraid of it. To put in a ramp is not that expensive. There are grants out there available for this type of thing as well. And we will continue to make sure all our schools are equipped with ramps as we work with the ministries, the different ministries, to really bring these persons to a level where they're comfortable. Like they said, they're persons first. And for me, I just love them because their drive and their determination. And I do endorse what David said about Dr. Douglas. I heard him speak and I was floored. He is an excellent presenter. And I'll never forget the talk that he gave probably 2-3 years ago that I attended. So that's it from the Digicel Foundation. If you want to reach out to us with questions, or if there's anything we can help you to do, if you would like to speak to Jannard, who sits on our team, who can just give you some tips, feel free. And I just want to close out by saying, as a foundation, we did this game for disaster preparedness for the children, the children that are disabled, and what we found was we thought we had a cool virtual reality game, you know, and we would teach them about what to do in a hurricane, what to do in an earthquake, and it was a great game. It's actually available on it's called Masters of Prep on the Play Store, in the Play Store. And we thought we had a great game until we gave it to Jannard to test out. And his comments and his feedback was just so important. So as you go about deciding what you do in your organizations, include persons with disabilities to just help you, to give you some direction and some perspective, because what we think is normal for us, really and truly, we have to adjust some of that thinking, right? So that's my encouragement to you guys, and we're here for anybody who wants to talk to us. Reach out, we're always available. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Charmaine. And what we're going to do now, I have some questions that have been posted in the chat. So I'm going to ask all our experts. Charmaine, if you think there's one that you can be a part of answering, feel free. Mrs. Jennings, Hickswell, Dr. Hendricks. So I'm going to read it. And then after that, we're actually going to open everyone's mic so we can have a free flow of ideas, thoughts, more questions and comments. So let me deal with these questions and anyone who would like to jump in. Before we get to employment, what are the plans re-education and post-secondary training for the disabled? Who would like to make a comment on that?
Right, so Christine Hendricks. So the Act speaks to the right of persons with disabilities to education and training. And it has, because we're dealing with employment today, we did not focus on the fulsomeness of that right. However, the Act fully outlines the fact that educational institutions, whether they're public or private, cannot deny persons with disabilities entry and participation in their facility. There is also a draft code of practice that the new JCPD will have to provide to stakeholders and to society that will provide that practical guidance in how to ensure that persons with disabilities are included in educational and training institutions from early childhood straight to post-secondary education. So that is also taken care of. But as I said, because this discussion was focusing on employment, although I know, and I did say that we should be advocating to ensure that, you know, training institutions and educational facilities have accessible programs to persons with disabilities, and ensure that their programs rather are accessible to persons with disabilities, to ensure that they can pass their exams and matriculate into the workplace. So that is very, very critical, and the Act speaks to it and the code outlines it. And we need to understand that the code is an important part of the Act and the regulations, they are akin and have just as much weight to them. So when the new JCPD comes on February 14, those will be available thereafter.
Okay, thank you for that. The next one is for a very good question based on companies who are trying to consider the changes. The question is, will there be templates of policies published so that private sector entities that want to develop policies can utilize, or would they have to be starting from scratch?
There will be templates. We have already, well, the current department, JCPD, has assisted a number of organizations in the private sector to craft their policies. And I'm sure the Combined Disabilities Association is also part of that. So once they reach out, as I said, there will be templates provided on our websites and so for persons to be guided. But persons or companies can always reach out to the JCPD or the Combined Disabilities Association for assistance in crafting those policies.
So they do not need to.
And some of the things that I mentioned today, when you're thinking about a policy, what are some of the things that are important to have? There's a good outline, you know, to be guided by.
Thank you very much. The next question is, will things like short-term, long-term disability insurance come into play when someone who has a disability cannot work for whatever period of time? Is there coverage for their income or other such things? That must be someone from the insurance industry asking that question. I'm not really sure that this is the right forum, but it's a good question, but I'm not sure if we think, but maybe.
The Disabilities Act spoke to the importance of providing insurance, but it is not specific in terms of what the person is asking. In Jamaica, though, the Council for Persons with Disabilities recognizes and registers persons with long-term impairments that would lead to, you know, the disability, and not short-term. So while I know that there are short-term, you know, like someone break a leg or, you know, meeting an accident and has a short-term disability, those are not the persons that the council registers. It has to be a long-term impairment, and that's important.
Okay. The next question is referring to access to employment. It says, will there be assistance in creation of ADs in formats accessible to people with disabilities, for example, Braille? I'm not quite sure if one of you could clarify what ADs mean. I'm not quite sure what that is.
Assistive aids.
Okay,
Devices.
Right. So, you know, some people get a little acronym crazy. So, yeah. Okay. Mrs. Jennings, would you like to answer that one?
Could you repeat that question, though?
Will there be assistance in creation of assistant? I'm sorry, ADs again. What was the ADs again?
Assistive devices.
Right. Will there be assistance in creation of assistance devices in formats accessible to people with disabilities? For example, Braille.
Well, in formats that are accessible to persons who are visually impaired or blind, well, that would be a requirement under the law in terms of the appropriate communication that should be available to all persons with disabilities. So it's not just Braille, but large print. And for the persons who have a challenge, currently the JCPD provides small support to assist persons in acquiring these assistive devices. So it's a measure that will certainly be ongoing. Of course, with limited funds. So we know the private sector will be supporting in this regard.
Can I add that the Ministry of Education has a Braille and large print unit, and the Jamaica Society for the Blind, and I think the Combined Disabilities Association, they also provide creation of Braille materials at a cost. So I'm sure that persons can check those entities. The Ministry of Education, Special Education Unit, the Jamaica Society for the Blind, Combined Disabilities Association. Possibly over time, as the council develops, such will also be provided.
Thank you. Last question, then we're going to throw the floor open. It says that Dr. Hendricks noted that websites should be accessible. Could she elaborate on what that means for persons who own or design websites? Good question.
Okay, so as part of the checklist for accessibility, there's a section that speaks to publishing content on the World Wide Web, and it should be designed to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that is published by the Web Accessibility Initiative of the World Wide Web Consortium, that's W3C. And persons can just Google W3C and pick up some content guide that will help them to comply with the guidelines to ensure that their websites are accessible. And some quick tips to make website accessible. It looks at images and animations, image maps, multimedia, hyperlink text or hypertext links, page organization, graphs and charts, scripts and so on, frames, tables, and so on. And most importantly, calling someone who is blind or call up someone who is blind. Dr. Hickswell Douglas is right here, and we have a number of other persons, Wilbert Williams, Conrad Harris, who are persons at the Jamaica Society for the Blind and who are blind, who can check your website and tell you if it is easy for them to maneuver. And if it is easy for them to maneuver, that's just one aspect. So persons who are blind can maneuver your website utilizing their software, their JAWS software or whatever software they may be using to ensure that their screen can read the information. But it also speaks to captioning, and it also speaking to simple language for persons with intellectual disabilities or those persons who we would say can't read and write so well. Sometimes we have so many words on our websites that the ordinary people either can't take the time or won't take the time to go on it and read it. So making it simple and easy to maneuver is the best way to move. And that information is available from the checklist that we have and can provide support to be guided by.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open the floor. There are actually some comments, not really questions. So, which is from Maureen Lorna Weber and also Marilyn McCoy. So what we're suggesting is if you just raise your hand and then they will acknowledge and you can make your point or a further question or comments that you would like. So the floor is open and I see Maureen has raised her hand. So what they will do is they will unmute you. Go ahead, Maureen.
Hi, good afternoon. For me, it's good afternoon here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And as a member of the PSOG, I'm really excited and proud to see that my PSOG is doing something like this around the disability conversation. So I really feel excited about that. One of the things I'm hoping that we work on across the board is language. So things like disabled people and people living with disabilities, we will work on correcting those. I'm sure with time, the intent is there and I know offense is not intended. So we need to work on that. Certainly, Christine, the issue of the legislation is so critical because for me, Brian doesn't have a physical disability, a visible disability. But if we get to the airport and I join the line for the person's disabilities, he's not blind, he's not in a wheelchair, he appears normal, but as you know, he's nonverbal and several other non-things. And I will have to fight to get in that line, for example. So I think that getting registered, I hate the label of feeling being labeled, but at the same time, because disabilities can be invisible, it presents a challenge. I know it's about education, but that bridge between education and about employment, but the bridge between employment and education is key. I think the foundation spoke to that bridge of saying, what does an employer do? if you cannot provide the spaces for the internships and the apprenticeships, you are still you're a critical part of that bridge, or reaching into the schools and helping them to say, okay, I have 2 or 3 jobs coming up, those kinds of things. I think we can't lose the link between the two, although I know that this conversation, and certainly for the PSOJ, is around employment. So that's my other comment at this point in time. But again, really, really a good session. And I really appreciate the fact that the PSOJ. It's one of the things I feel like I'm glad I'm a member. It's one of these moments I'm proud I'm a member. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Damian McLean. Damian, they'll unmute you in a second.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes. Hi, Maureen. Let me to commend the PSOJ for putting on this, are partnering with the JCPD to do this forum. I think it's a beautiful forum to get the issues in the public domain and to have the discourse so as to bring about some resolution and better understanding in terms of going forward. My question is to Mrs. Charmaine Daniels. I'm not sure if I understood clearly what she was saying about not employing somebody who is blind based on the fact that there was no speaking elevator in place. I just wanted some clarity on that. And I'm hoping that I'm not mistaken in terms of what I'm interpreting from it. So if she could just speak to it, I would appreciate that.
Hi. So no, what among the cohort of persons with disabilities that we have, we do not have anybody that's blind. That's not a deliberate decision in hiring. But when we started to really look at the act is coming, and are we, as an advocate for disabilities, are we positioned to really hire persons with disabilities? One of the things we realized in just going through and seeing what we needed to have is an elevator that would let you know what floor you were on. How our elevators are set up is you'd press the number at the bottom and there's nothing else to do until it takes you to your floor. But we just recognize as a company that that is something that we need to put in. So in the event that we do have someone who is blind or visually impaired, that they would be able to traverse the building at ease. And so that's the comment I was trying to make. So even us as Digicel, who have been around for a long time, who have employed persons with disabilities for a long time, we are still not where I am proud or I am happy. I need to fix that little bit. So that's the comment I was trying to make. And it's just really an encouragement to say, you know, you'll see a long checklist and you'll see all these things that you need to have in place. But I didn't want companies to think you have to have everything perfect before you can employ persons from this community.
So what you're really saying, Charmaine, is you saw a problem before it was even a problem, and I was hoping to rectify.
Correct. And that is what we are doing, yes.
Okay, Maureen, Lorna Weber, your hand is up.
Marilyn had something to say too, but she said she's having technical challenges, so she placed her question in the chat.
Okay, just a quick comment on what Charmaine just said about, and I think the issue is universal access, a key element, because when you do that, you're going to have clients who are blind. And so when you move, when we move up the scale from reasonable accommodation all the way to universal access, it will address the issue really, Charmaine, that some of your clients are going to be blind. Some are going to get older and we're going to be blind or going to be hard of hearing anyway. So in a lot of ways, the inclusion really is about including all. I mean, it's about us in the community of persons with disabilities, but moving to inclusion is really ultimate in rights of all human beings, really.
Okay, so the question is, what are the questions on census 22? Is that what she's asking us to read? data. Okay, where's that one? Hang on, let me see if I can find the question that they're asking us to read.
Data collection, Marilyn McCoy.
Okay. Hang on, I'll just have to scroll up to find that. Data is critical to understanding the impact of the Act, especially in relation to employment. What will be the role of the private and public sectors in actively participating in the data collection process? Anyone who would like to answer that? Dr. Hendrickson? I'm sorry, Dr. Hendrick?
Yes. That is so true. Data collection is critical because without the data, we're uncertain of how we're planning and planning effectively. And so aside from the JCPD registering and having that database, it is critical that starting in the census collects the data. It is important that employers and the Ministry of Labor collect the data in terms of employment. And it is important that the agencies of persons with disabilities have the data, and we have, should I say, a single storage of collation of all of that data. The Ministry of Labor that does the labor market survey would have to ensure that it, in analyzing the data on employment, include persons with disabilities. So employers who are employing would need to have that information available. Schools with persons with disabilities would also need to capture the data of the number of students in their institutions. And so, as she rightly asked, private and public sectors need to actively participate in this data collection process, because the convention highlights it. It is not brought out as clearly as defined in the Disabilities Act to say data collection is critical, but it is critical from the registration process and the mandatory confidential register that the JCPD will be having. It is critical for that data to be collected from our different stakeholders so that we can have the different analysis at the different points of data collection. And starting is very important in this conversation. I will say again, I know that in answering the other question regarding data, starting does have the, I think it is the short questions on the Washington group of questions, some of the short questions from the Washington group of questions as part of the census, but it doesn't capture the disability data as comprehensively as it needs to. And so that's a conversation that will need to be had at that level. So right across the board, it is critical, because that's the only way we can know how many students are coming out of school, the different types of disability, the different skill sets that they have, where they would need to be placed, the job market that will be open to them, what is it that they can go into. So similarly to how we analyze data for the general public, it is critical for persons with disabilities. David, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I said, since we have you on the floor, Dr. Hendricks, what are the benefits of registering an employee with long-term disabilities?
The benefits, as I said earlier, the first thing is the certificate of registration that they will get to identify them as a person with a disability in instances where that identification becomes important. And there are benefits. There is the income tax exemption from the Income Tax Exemption Act that speaks to the fact that persons with disabilities who are so approved by the Ministry of Health can access income tax exemption once they are employed and they're earning a salary over the income tax threshold. So that is one other benefit. And of course, there are other benefits if they need to report discrimination, it would be good to be registered with the council, you know, to have your information on file, so it will be easily, you know, once you come in to complain, you don't have to go register and come back, you know. So registering up front before even challenge. Did you lose me or did I lose you?
Yes, we lost you a little.
I think you froze for a few seconds there, but you're back.
What was the last thing that you heard?
Registering upfront.
Right, I was saying that registering upfront before a challenge exists is very, very critical. So even before you need a benefit, register. It's important.
Okay. One last question. Is diabetes, lupus, and other such considered disabilities under our act? And would those persons be able to register?
Okay, so diabetes and lupus in and of themselves are not the disabilities, but they can cause the disability. So from diabetes, if the person ends up being blind or acquires blindness or visual impairment, or if they acquire the loss of a limb because of the diabetes, then what the impairment is what is considered and not the illness. Similarly for lupus, in and of itself, it is an illness, but it can cause varying mobility and other challenges. And so when it gets to the impairments, those are what we would register. You know, that is a time when we would register the person with, as they would now have a disability, as indicated by a medical professional. Because that process, the registration process, includes, importantly, the eligibility form, which has to be completed by a medical practitioner to verify the disability.
Thank you for that. We're going to wrap it up now, but I would just like to thank all of our panelists, Dr. Christine Hendricks, Mrs. Dion Jennings, Ms. Charmaine Daniels, Dr. Hickswell Douglas, and also for Stephanie McIntyre Groves, our sign language interpreter. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists. I'd like to thank the people who tuned in to hear our webinar, for being part of this conversation put on by the PSO, Private Sector Organization Jamaica. Today's webinar would not have been possible without the kind support of our sponsors, Lifespan and the Digital Foundation, and also we'd like to thank Affinity, who are provided technical support. Rest assured, this will not be the only webinar put on by the Disabilities and Gender Committee of the PSOJ. So we'd like you to stay tuned, stay involved, and we thank our entire audience. So we'll see you at our next webinar, and may everyone have a good day. Thank you.